9 experienced hikers walked into the Russian wilderness on a clear winter evening. None of them ever walked back out. What investigators found at their campsite weeks later was so disturbing, so completely impossible to explain, that Soviet authorities sealed the official case files for over 30 years. Even today, after decades of investigation, modern forensic analysis, and dozens of competing theories, nobody, not a single person on this earth, can tell you with absolute certainty what happened on that frozen mountain in February 1959. But here is what we do know, and trust me, the facts alone are terrifying enough. Igor Dyatlov was 23 years old, and he was the kind of person who made everyone around him feel safe. He was calm, methodical, experienced, and deeply respected by everyone who knew him. The 9 people who followed him into the Ural Mountains that winter were not beginners. They were trained athletes, engineering students, and seasoned mountaineers. This was not their first dangerous expedition. They had done this before, many times. They knew the risks, they had the equipment, the skills, the experience, and the confidence to handle whatever the mountain threw at them. That is what makes everything that followed so deeply unsettling. The group set off on January 23, 1959, heading toward Otorten Mountain in the northern Ural region. Their plan was straightforward. They would trek through the wilderness, summit the mountain, and return safely within a few weeks. Before leaving, Igor sent regular updates through letters and diary entries. The group was in good spirits. They were laughing, singing songs around campfires, and writing playful journal entries that felt more like a college road trip than a dangerous wilderness expedition. The last photograph taken by the group shows them smiling in the snow, completely unaware of what was quietly approaching them. Then, on the night of February 1st, something happened. Something so sudden, so overwhelming, so absolutely terrifying that 9 trained, experienced, rational adults made a decision that defied every survival instinct a human being possesses. They sliced open their tent from the inside. Not unzipped it, sliced it, tore through the fabric with a knife in a desperate, panicked rush. They burst out into the open Arctic night wearing almost nothing. No shoes, no coats. Some were in their socks. The temperature outside was -30 degrees Celsius. They ran away from their tent, away from their warmth, their food, their safety, and they ran directly into the darkness of the frozen forest below. Whatever they were running from, they believed without any doubt that staying inside that tent would kill them faster than the cold ever could. They chose the mountain. They chose the darkness. They chose certain frostbite over whatever was waiting for them inside. And that single choice, made in pure terror on a freezing Russian night, started one of the most haunting mysteries in modern human history. The question is, what did they see?
Rescue teams did not reach the mountain until weeks later. The families had been waiting, hoping, convincing themselves that the delay was just bad weather or a simple communication problem. But when the searchers finally arrived at the campsite on February 26th, what they found erased every comfortable explanation anyone had tried to construct. The tent was half buried in snow, visibly collapsed, and cut open from the inside with jagged, desperate slashes. Inside, the hikers had left behind everything: food, warm clothing, boots, cameras, money, a working flashlight. Everything was still there, completely untouched, arranged as though the group had simply stepped outside for a moment and planned to return immediately. They never did. The first 2 bodies were found at the edge of the forest, roughly a mile and a half from the tent. Yuri Doroshenko and Yuri Krivonischenko were lying near the remains of a small fire they had tried to build under a large cedar tree. They were nearly naked. The cold had taken them completely. But here is the first detail that stops investigators cold even today. Branches on that cedar tree had been broken off as high as 5 meters up. Someone had climbed that tree in the dark, in freezing temperatures, with bare or nearly bare hands. They had been desperately trying to see something, or desperately trying to get away from something on the ground below them. 3 more bodies were found shortly after, scattered in a line between the cedar tree and the tent. Igor Dyatlov himself was found lying on his back, his face turned upward toward the sky, one arm raised slightly as though frozen mid-reach. Zinaida Kolmogorova was found not far away, face down in the snow. Rustem Slobodin was found between them. The positioning of the bodies told investigators something deeply emotional and heartbreaking. These 3 had not given up. Evidence suggested they had been crawling, fighting, pushing themselves through the snow trying to get back to the tent. They had been trying to survive. They died trying. But the remaining 4 hikers were not found until May, when the snow finally began to melt, and when rescuers discovered them in a ravine roughly 75 meters deeper into the forest. Every assumption anyone had made about this case shattered completely. These 4 had better clothing than the others. They had clearly tried to help each other, sharing garments, attempting to stay warm together. But their injuries made no sense at all. Lyudmila Dubinina had suffered fractures to multiple ribs on both sides of her chest. Semyon Zolotaryov had identical rib fractures. The force required to cause those injuries was compared by the medical examiner to a serious car crash or a powerful explosion. And yet, and this is the part that haunts everyone, there was no external bruising on their skin, no wounds, no cuts, just catastrophic internal damage delivered by a force that left absolutely no visible trace on the outside of their bodies. And Lyudmila was missing her tongue. The Soviet government launched an official investigation immediately. Investigators were sent to the site, evidence was collected, autopsies were performed, and witness testimonies were gathered. And then, after months of examination, the official conclusion was released. It stated that the hikers had died due to an unknown compelling force. That was the exact language used in the official Soviet report. An unknown compelling force. Think about what that means. Government investigators, trained professionals working for one of the most powerful states on Earth, examined every piece of available evidence and concluded that they had absolutely no idea what killed these people. They closed the case. They classified the remaining files, and they told the families of the 9 victims that the truth was simply unknowable. But the families never accepted that answer, and neither did the investigators who were quietly haunted by what they had seen. One of the lead investigators, Lev Ivanov, spent decades saying very little about the case publicly. But in 1990, near the end of his life, he finally spoke. He said that during the investigation, local Mansi tribesmen had reported seeing glowing orange spheres moving through the sky above the mountain on the night the hikers died. He said that members of his own team had witnessed similar lights during their time at the site. And he said, very quietly, that he had always believed the explanation for what happened involved something that his government had no interest in acknowledging publicly. He never named what he believed that something was. He simply stopped talking about it. The mysterious lights were not a fringe detail invented years later. They were documented at the time. Multiple independent witnesses in different locations reported seeing large glowing orbs moving silently across the sky in the northern Ural region during the same period the hikers disappeared. Some of these witnesses were military personnel. Their testimonies were collected, recorded, and then quietly removed from circulation. Whatever those lights were, someone in the Soviet government decided very quickly that the public did not need to know about them. That decision alone tells you something deeply uncomfortable about what was happening in those mountains. Then came the detail about the radiation. When the bodies of the final 4 victims were examined, 2 of them, Krivonischenko and Dubinina, showed elevated levels of radioactive contamination on their clothing. Not extreme levels, not levels that would indicate a nuclear explosion, but enough radiation to be clearly detectable, clearly abnormal, and clearly unexplained, given that the group had no contact with any known radioactive materials during their journey. Investigators noted the finding. They included it in their reports, And then, just like the glowing spheres and the classified testimonies, the radiation evidence was quietly buried beneath layers of official silence. Every explanation seems to answer one question while creating three more. Avalanche theories cannot explain why the tent showed no avalanche damage and why experienced hikers would run toward a forest instead of away from sliding snow. Panic theories cannot explain the internal injuries. Weapon theories cannot explain the absence of external wounds. Something happened on that mountain, something that fit no existing category, something that left behind only questions. And the most frightening question of all is coming next.
Decades passed. The Soviet Union collapsed. Files were slowly, partially declassified. New investigators with modern tools revisited the evidence. And with every new examination, the mystery did not shrink. It grew. Because the more carefully anyone looked at the Dyatlov Pass incident, the more they found that individual details which seemed explainable in isolation became completely impossible to explain when viewed together as a single event. That is the defining characteristic of this case. Nothing fits. Nothing connects in any normal, rational human way. And that wrongness is precisely what makes it so deeply disturbing to anyone who studies it seriously. In 2019, Russian authorities officially reopened the case after years of pressure from the Dyatlov Foundation, an organization founded by the victims' surviving family members. Modern forensic teams were brought in. New interviews were conducted with elderly witnesses who had never spoken publicly before. Advanced simulations were run to test the avalanche theory using the actual slope angles and snow density recorded at the site. And after all of it, after every modern tool available to science was applied to the evidence, the Russian government released its new official conclusion in 2020. Their answer was an avalanche, a specific type of delayed slab avalanche triggered by wind conditions. But here is the problem. The forensic engineers and independent investigators who reviewed that conclusion immediately and loudly disagreed. The slope at the tent's location was not steep enough to generate the kind of avalanche that could produce the injuries found on the victims. The snow conditions recorded at the site did not match the profile needed for a slab avalanche. And most damning of all, search teams who arrived at the campsite weeks after the incident found no avalanche debris anywhere near the tent. The snow around the site was disturbed, yes, but not by a massive wall of falling ice and snow. The disturbance pattern was inconsistent with any known avalanche formation. The government's tidy explanation collapsed almost immediately under scrutiny. Meanwhile, something else had been quietly circulating among researchers for years, a detail so specific, so strange, and so difficult to explain away that most mainstream accounts of the case simply choose not to mention it at all. The skin of several victims had reportedly taken on an unusual orange or bronze discoloration after death. The medical examiners who performed the autopsies noted it. Experienced morticians who prepared the bodies for burial remarked on it. Some attributed it to decomposition, others weren't sure. But the discoloration, combined with the radiation on the clothing, combined with the internal injuries without external wounds, combined with the glowing spheres in the sky, when you lay all of these details side by side and stare at them together, a feeling begins to build in your chest that is very difficult to name and very difficult to dismiss. These were real people. Zina loved hiking and wrote poetry. Igor was going to graduate that spring. Lyudmila sang folk songs around campfires. They were 23, 24 years old. They were alive, and then something erased them from this mountain in a single night. Whatever it was powerful enough to be terrifying to people who feared almost nothing, and it has never, not once in 66 years, been satisfactorily explained. There is a moment that every serious researcher describes when they have spent enough time inside the Dyatlov Pass case. It is not a moment of revelation or understanding. It is actually the opposite. It is the moment when you realize that the deeper you go, the less solid the ground beneath you feels. Every answer creates a new absence. Every explanation reveals a new impossibility. And you begin to understand that this case is not simply unsolved, it is structured in a way that resists solution at a fundamental level, as though the truth of what happened on that mountain exists just outside the boundary of what human understanding is currently equipped to process. Some researchers believe the answer is military. Secret Soviet weapons tests conducted in the northern Urals during the same period. Infrasound experiments, parachute mine detonations tested at high altitude. There is documented evidence that the Soviet military was extremely active in the region during those years, and some of the injuries found on the victims are consistent with pressure wave trauma from explosive devices. The radiation contamination could fit within certain weapons testing scenarios, and the speed with which the case was classified, the thoroughness with which certain evidence was removed from public record, all of it suggests a government that already knew more than it was ever willing to say. Others believe the answer is something that military explanations cannot fully contain. The Mansi people, who have lived in those mountains for generations, have always called Otorten Mountain by a name that translates roughly to "do not go there." They knew something about that place long before 9 students from Ural Polytechnic ever set foot on it. Ancient knowledge carried across centuries of living inside a wilderness that outsiders visited briefly and left, or did not leave at all. The mountain has its own history, its own memory, and whatever it holds has not yet finished keeping its secrets. What we are left with is this: 9 young people entered a mountain in a winter night, full of life and music and plans for the future. Something found them there. Something so immediate, so overwhelming, so beyond the categories of their experience that every survival instinct they possessed overrode every rational thought and sent them running barefoot into the frozen dark. They did not panic over nothing. Experienced mountaineers do not abandon warm shelter in -30 temperatures over a dream or a noise or a misunderstanding. Something was there, something real, something that has never been named, never been caught, and never been explained in any way that closes the question permanently. The files that remain classified still number in the thousands. The witnesses who are still alive grow fewer every year. The mountain has not changed. The pass still carries the name of the young man who led his friends into it and never returned. And the question that has quietly consumed researchers, investigators, and curious minds for 66 years remains completely, terrifyingly open. If you were standing in that tent on that night and you saw what they saw, what could possibly make you choose the mountain over the warmth? If this story reached somewhere deep inside you, subscribe to Lost Beyond Sight. Share this with someone who loves a mystery that refuses to die, and tell us in the comments, what do you believe happened on Dyatlov Pass?